Hey, good to see you. I'm Robert Clifton Robinson, a Christian author, philosopher, and apologist. The title of this study today is The Resurrection of Jesus and His Hostile Witnesses. It's interesting that in a court of law there are certain hostile witnesses who may give testimony in opposition to your case. These people will state that they saw you at a particular place during a specific time, saying and doing certain things. These witnesses are not on your side, nor is it their intention to help you or to seek to validate your side of the story. A hostile witness, also known as an adverse witness or an unfavorable witness, is a person whose testimony is either openly antagonistic or is in opposition to the one who's on trial. When a person who is antagonistic towards those who are on trial makes statements that are a part of the written record, their testimony becomes extremely important. Although these hostile witnesses have no desire or intention to help your case, they may accomplish this very thing by their adversarial comments. Take, for example, the case of Jesus, his crucifixion and his resurrection. Some people say that Jesus is merely a myth and that he never existed. Others say that he was not crucified at all. Many people have concluded that Jesus was not resurrected from the dead. These persons who make these conclusions, they do so primarily because they believe that the New Testament is the only source for these stories. When we examine the historical record of these secular sources, during the same time that the New Testament places Jesus in Jerusalem, we find evidence of his presence in Jerusalem, where he is both crucified and resurrected from the dead in non-biblical sources. The Jewish Talmud contains several references to Jesus by name. The records of the Roman Senate contain references to Jesus by name, and the historian Josephus also describes Jesus by name. Now, it's important to realize that none of these secular sources had any intention of preserving a record of Jesus in their history. But this is precisely what they've done by their adversarial references to him in their writing. In the Talmud, the Jews refer to Jesus on several occasions. Writing in 63 AD, the Babylonian Sanhedrin 43a and b describes Jesus as crucified in 4 places. And the following is the reference from that. On the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, "He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his own behalf." But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. Now, although critics dispute this verse as written about Jesus, there are key elements mentioned in this text which leave no doubt as to who the text was written in reference to. First of all, notice the name Yeshua. This is an ancient Aramaic name for Jesus. And then it says practiced sorcery. This is a reference to Jesus' miracles. That's what they said about his miracles. It says enticed Israel to apostasy. And this is Jesus' reference to the fulfillment by himself of the Old Testament law of Moses. And finally, he was hanged on a tree on the eve of Passover. This leaves no doubt that this references only to Jesus, who was crucified on the eve of Passover in 32 AD. There are actually 49 references to Jesus in the Jewish Talmud. Not one of these were written for the purpose of confirming to the world that Jesus was a real person, or that he was the Messiah who was crucified and resurrected. All of these references in the Talmud were recorded because of the problems that Jesus caused in Jerusalem as a record of these events. When these 49 references are examined, they prove that the New Testament has told us the truth regarding Jesus. He was in Jerusalem. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he existed as a real person. Now, one of these secular references is Suetonius. We see equally compelling references to Jesus in the records of the Roman Senate for the same period of history that the New Testament places Jesus there. In the writings of Suetonius, we find that the uprising which Jesus caused in Jerusalem amongst the Jews, they referred to him by name as Chrestus, which is the Roman equivalent of the Christ. For more than 30 years, Suetonius had access to the imperial and senatorial archives of the Romans, as well as many other contemporary public documents. According to historical experts of that period, much of the information that is left to us from Suetonius about the Roman Caesars came from eyewitness accounts. Unlike Tacitus, Suetonius fact-checked the material that was contained within the Roman archives and made sure of their accuracy. According to Suetonius, Jesus was well known to the Roman government as the primary source for all of the disturbances reported by Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. In the book The 12 Caesars by Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, he writes the following: because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from the city. This is a direct corroboration of the text of Tacitus, who also said the same things about Jesus, and he had received his information also from the Roman archives. When we team together with Tacitus and Suetonius, their records, there's no doubt that the text in the Roman record that describes Jesus in Jerusalem, creating a disturbance which resulted in his crucifixion under Pilate, that these are true records of these events. These records of the Roman Senate serve as additional empirical evidence for us today with the Jewish Talmud that corroborates Jesus as a genuine person of history, in specific confirmation of exactly what the New Testament narrative of him says. The text that we just talked about from Suetonius describes the expulsion of Christians from Rome, but it's also reported by the New Testament book of Acts. In Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 2, it says, "After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded the Jews to depart from Rome, and he came to them." So this serves as further evidence for the precise nature of the New Testament, accounts of Jesus, and the influence that he presented in both Jerusalem and in Rome. The fact that Suetonius recorded the expulsion of Christians in Rome, while at the same time Luke is writing and describing the same event, is incredible corroboration of the New Testament accuracy. Now, concerning Saul of Tarsus, we see in the New Testament that there is a similar hostile testimony as those from the Talmud and the Suetonius from Saul that we see in the book of Acts. Now, some people might have difficulty in believing the testimony of someone who already believes in Jesus. They might say their opinion is biased towards him. But what about a person who is a hater of Jesus and all those who followed him? What about Saul of Tarsus, a leader amongst the Pharisees, a Hebrew scholar who was trained by the esteemed Rabbi Gamaliel? Saul was not a follower of Jesus. In fact, he had obtained documents from the Sanhedrin to hunt down and persecute the followers of Jesus. When Stephen stood before the gathered crowd and he declared that Jesus was both Lord and Messiah, whom the Jewish leaders had crucified, the people picked up stones and murdered Stephen. In the book of Acts, in chapter 7, Paul openly sanctified this execution. He even held the garments of the men, it says in the text, who picked up stones to kill Stephen. In every way possible, Saul was extremely hostile towards Jesus and all those who trusted in him. This all changed while Saul was on the road to Damascus. In Acts chapter 9, there is a stunning testimony of what happened to Saul as he's traveling from Jerusalem to Damascus, Syria. In Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, we read, "Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogue of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way," that's what they call Christians, of the way, "whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem." As Saul traveled to Damascus, suddenly a bright light from above appeared all around him. The text in Acts says that Saul fell to the ground and he saw Jesus saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" And then Jesus said, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." Then Jesus said to Saul, "Arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." Now, incredibly, near the same time that all this is taking place, Jesus also spoke to a man in Damascus called Ananias. And he told him to go to a street called Straight and inquire at the house of Judas where he would find Saul. Now, this is an interesting statement because Ananias was terrified by Jesus' instructions because he had heard many stories about how Saul had caused great suffering and death for the followers of Jesus. We read this in Acts chapter 9, beginning at verse 13 and continuing to verse 16. Then Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he's done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name." But the Lord said to Ananias, "Go, for Saul is my chosen vessel, to bear my name before the Gentiles, before kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how many things he must suffer for my sake." So great was Saul's persecution of the followers of Jesus all throughout Jerusalem and the surrounding area that none of the followers of Jesus would trust him after he claimed to have seen the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. Despite Saul in his earlier persecution of the followers of Jesus, we see him later as now the chief advocate for Jesus and his resurrection. When we examine the text, we find that Saul wrote more about Jesus and his resurrection from the dead than any other writer in the New Testament. There are 30 direct references to Jesus and his resurrection in the New Testament scriptures. 12 of these are in the 4 Gospels. 15 references to Jesus' resurrection are written by Paul in his letters, and 3 are written by Peter. So, how is it that a Pharisee, a Jewish scholar trained by Gamaliel, and a persecutor of those who follow Jesus, he suddenly becomes a believer himself? There's only one explanation. What Saul said was true. He saw Jesus alive on the road to Damascus. There are some who discount the testimony about Jesus in the New Testament. They do this because they say it's purely a religious book. Although this is the primary objective of this text, because it details the entire life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. These 27 books also remain for us as a valid historical record. Now, historical documents are not solely determined as valid historical instruments by the intent or the subject of their writing. What constitutes a reliable document of historical significance is by the events they describe and the period of time from where they originate from. When we read the New Testament for ourselves, without any commentary as a reference, we see that none of the events in these 27 books were written as an allegory, a myth, or a legend. Those who have done their due diligence to study the New Testament understand that it was written as an accurate historical preservation of true events which actually took place. Now, every scholar who has set out to disprove the details that are described in the New Testament has been convinced later by the evidence they found. They discovered that the narratives which are recorded in its pages are reliable historical records. One of the best examples of this is world-famous historian and renowned archaeologist Dr. William Ramsay. He began as an atheist in his exploration of New Testament validity. Upon an expedition to the places described by the New Testament in Asia, Dr. Ramsay discovered the pristine accuracy of Luke's narrative. He concluded that the record of Jesus Christ in the New Testament is true, and later, as a result of this evidence, he became a follower of Jesus. Dr. Ramsay describes Luke in his writings as a historian of the first rank. So, though some may not like to admit the historical relevance of the New Testament, this is nevertheless precisely what the New Testament is. These texts have survived 2,000 years, and they come to us with nearly 25,000 surviving manuscript copies. These are numbers greater than any other historical literature in all of human history. For this reason, and because the internal evidence of Saul's conversion from hater and persecutor of Jesus and all of his followers to a lover and chief advocate for Christ and his gospel remain for us today as empirical and compelling evidence. Saul denied that Jesus had risen from the dead, and he said adamantly that Jesus was not the Messiah. After his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, Saul becomes the primary advocate for Jesus and the deliverer of the message that Jesus had risen from the dead and is the promised Messiah. He said this because Paul was a scholar. He knew that Jesus fulfilled all of the 400 plus prophecies of the Old Testament that were required of the Messiah. I detailed all 400 of these prophecies in my book, The Prophecies of the Messiah, that you can see at Amazon. Throughout all of Paul's letters, we find repeatedly his emphasis on Jesus as being raised from the dead. Paul said that Jesus is the true Messiah and the only way to be reconciled to God. Most interesting amongst all of the places that Paul talks about the resurrection is 1 Corinthians 15, beginning at verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which you also received, in which you also stand, by which you are also saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed it in vain. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures, and he was seen by Peter, and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 witnesses at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have passed away. After that, he was seen by James, and then by all the apostles. Last of all, he was seen by me, Paul says, as one born out of due time. And Paul says, I am the least of all the apostles, who am not really worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God which was with me. Therefore, whether it was I or they, so we all preached, so that you could believe. So here we have it. These hostile witnesses of Jesus and his resurrection that have remained in the written and preserved historical record for 2,000 years. The text which describes Jesus as crucified and risen from the dead on the third day has never been impeached, or has it been shown to be fraudulent or a fabrication. The Old Testament scriptures predicted a Messiah who would be crucified and risen from the dead, and this is precisely what Jesus accomplished. The facts of the Jewish Talmud, the Roman Senate archives, and the conversion of Saul as a Pharisaical Jewish scholar to faith in Jesus Christ because he saw him alive on the road to Damascus are testimonies of witnesses who were not on the side of Jesus, but men who were in opposition to him and his cause. For this reason, these witnesses are compelling evidence that what the New Testament says about Jesus is the truth. These facts are a few of the thousands that are included in my books that I've published at Amazon and my personal website. You can find these books at Amazon.com and also under my author's name, Robert Clifton Robinson. My personal website is found at www.robertcliftonrobinson.com. I want to thank you for spending a few minutes with me as I talk with you about the incredible evidence for faith in Jesus and the testimony of his words found in the New Testament scriptures. May the Lord continue to bless your life as you study his word and seek him with all of your heart.